Imagine for a moment, if you will, how awful an ordeal it would be to spend 17 years in prison for a very serious offence that you did not commit. That's what I'm talking about in this video. Please stay tuned. Welcome back to the channel. So many of you have probably now seen this face doing its rounds on various news outlets across social media, and you'll probably recognize that this is the man that spent 17 years in prison for this offence, which is on screen now. And he's been released because of new evidence which rendered the conviction unsafe. But many of you will be forgiven for not understanding exactly what that evidence was, why it's overturned the conviction. And I regret to say that some of you will still think that he is guilty of this because he was tried and found guilty and so on. Now, just as an aside, as an interesting aside, when one is tried of a crime, there is no finding of innocent, which we've discussed in previous videos. You are found guilty or not guilty, but not guilty is not necessarily the same as innocent. It is not proof that the person is innocent. It just means that there wasn't enough to find them guilty, so they are found to be not guilty. Now, that's a bit of a philosophical debate, and a lot of people can infer what they think not guilty means. A lot of people will think not guilty is the same as innocent, and it should be, and that's how it should be understood. It is not a finding of innocence. It's a finding that they are not guilty on the evidence that's put before them. So they have not been, the prosecutor has not proved the case. But when a conviction is quashed, that really has similar questions raised. Now, I will caveat this to say I'm not a criminal specialist. This is just me commenting on this generally. But when a conviction is quashed, it is as though that conviction, the finding of guilty, never happened. Now, coming to the evidence itself, as you'll see on this article by the BBC here, having spent 17 years in prison for this crime that he did not commit, many of you will wonder what the evidence was. Now, essentially, there was a photograph that the police withheld in evidence. Now, disclosure of evidence is fundamental to a fair trial, and there is an ongoing duty of disclosure, both by the police and by the CPS. It's ultimately the prosecutor's role. They have a disclosure officer whose responsibility it is to ensure that disclosure is done properly and consistently and continuously throughout the trial. Very broadly speaking, the test for disclosure is that any material that is reasonably capable of undermining the prosecution case or assisting the defense. And in this case, it was photographs that were not provided by the police. The Court of Appeal said, Mr. Malkinson had felt vindicated by the court's finding that evidence was withheld unlawfully and caused this wrongful conviction nightmare. The photographs showed that the victim's nail, left middle finger, was noticeably shorter than the other fingernails, which corroborated her evidence that she had scratched her attacker's face. Now, taking that as it is, this man, the defendant at that time, did not have a scratch on his face, but her evidence was that she had scratched him. So his defense team was unable to highlight to the jury that he'd had no such scratch injury to his face, but the court had said if the photographs had been disclosed, the jury's verdict may have been different. Because if the victim's evidence was that she had scratched her attacker's face and the defendant had no such scratch injury to his face, and there were photographs to show that corroborated her evidence as to the fingernail being shorter for that reason. But there's more. The court also went on to talk about 2 eyewitnesses who identified this defendant and that they had convictions for dishonesty offences. Now, as a very broad tangent here, when somebody has a conviction for dishonesty, there could be what we call an application to produce bad character, meaning you can bring in a previous conviction to attack the credibility of a witness or somebody else, and the court can grant or not grant that application so as to reduce that evidence of bad character, being the convictions for dishonesty, and highlight those to the jury. In this case, the court said that if the previous convictions had been disclosed during the trial, it would have been capable of casting doubt on the general honesty and capable of affecting the jury's view as to whether they were civil-minded persons doing their best to assist. So, in essence, 2 eyewitnesses with convictions for dishonesty may not have been telling the truth. And had that been highlighted to the jury, they may have, again, in conjunction with the photograph evidence, may have thought differently. The judge added, in our judgment, the challenge to the character and credibility of the 2 identified witnesses would have been capable of affecting the jury's overall view as to whether they could be sure that the appellant was correctly identified. And just as one final point on this whole story, many of you may remember that this defendant, having had the conviction quashed, was then said to have had a deduction made to pay for the time that he spent in prison and essentially bed and board for the time that he was in prison. I personally felt that that was quite an insult. If someone has been wrongly convicted, wrongly incarcerated for 17 years, and then from any compensation had deducted money for bed and board for that time. But this divisive rule that deducts the funds from the compensation paid, UK Justice Secretary has scrapped the rule on Sunday with immediate effect following this case and labelled it as abhorrent. I think that's the correct decision. I think that would have been quite an insult to have had a deduction, significant deduction. I think it was in the region of £500,000. I'll stand to be corrected, but I think it was in the region of £500,000 bed and board for the 17 years that he was wrongly imprisoned. Let me know what you think in the comments to any of that. If you had any thoughts about this already, does that change your view with the photographs and the 2 witnesses with dishonesty convictions? Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think generally. And as always, keep the comment section polite and civil, please. And with that, I thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe. I'll see you next time.